There's just one word I would like to mention, and maybe Helena, you want to fill in on that, and that is this word,
resilience,
which becomes more and more common in discussions. Resilient, resilience. We have the new Stockholm Resilience Center, for example. Would you like, Helena, before we start, to give your definition of resilience?
Okay. Now?
You can?
Yeah.
I know some more people are going to come in here, so.
Okay, so resilience comes from different disciplines. You have the resilience from the biodiversity science, from the medical and psychological, the torture victims were resilient. But the way that we use resilience in climate context and for disaster reduction purposes, Mette spoke about this morning as well, is basically the way it means that the ability of a system, community, or society exposed to any type of hazard or threat, for them to resist, absorb, or accommodate from that hazard, and to through preservation, restoration of its essential basic structures and functions. So it's the ability to bounce back and restore abilities and functions.
Can I try with one word?
Yes.
In Swedish?
Yes.
Motståndskraft.
Motståndskraft, but it's more than motståndskraft because it's also motståndskraft and the ability to improve and overcome. Because motstånd, you just say no and I resist, but it's resist and overcome. Motstånd och återhämtning kanske. Ja.
Okay. With this discussion, I give the floor to Helena Molin Valdes from the United Nations UNISDR, and I'm sure you will tell us more about that.
Okay. So last speakers, many interesting views and reflections until now. So I just wanted to say a few words on who we are. Maybe you can go to next. I don't even remember what's next, but okay. Actually, ISDR, International Strategy for Disaster Reduction, it's a strategy. The United Nations and the member states of United Nations decided in 2000 to launch this strategy as an inclusive and cooperative, this one, okay, to work together to establish a framework of action and common understanding of resilience, disaster reduction management options, and different types of methods to reduce risk for the future, including to climate variability, extremes, and climate change. So the United Nations has a small secretariat where I work to coordinate this type of strategy. We have an office in Geneva, we have 5-6 offices out in the regions, and we have a small function in New York where the headquarters of the United Nations works as well. And basically we work through our national focal points and national platforms. Mette this morning spoke about how Sweden is organized. So this is how we work. We also work very much with our other United Nations programs and funds, such as United Nations Environmental Program, World Meteorological Organization, UNICEF, Development Program, etc., etc. All of them have their piece and slice of disaster reduction programming, and ISDR is the over-encompassing strategy for all of us. I wanted to start with a quote, because we have spoken a lot about, we just had NATO on the line, I don't know if you're still on the line, but we spoke about how to overcome, what's the security angle of climate change, and then the resilience factor is, how do we overcome the problems and the vulnerabilities, so to say, that climate and other extremes. We talk about earthquakes, all kinds of geological hazards, technological hazards, and climate-related extreme events as being part of this international strategy for disaster reduction. In the end, the underlying factors are all the same for all these hazards. So I like to use this quote just to kind of explain why we work on these issues and that it's actually worthwhile. This is a governor from a very, very hazard-prone area in the Philippines, in the middle of the Philippines, Albay province. Everything, you name it, it's there. He has been a governor for, I think, 3 or 4 re-election times. He has been a banker. He's a former banker. He has been economic advisor to the presidency of the Philippines. And since he started 10 years ago, he actually spend 9% of his provincial budget on what we call disaster risk reduction issues and förebyggande verksamhet. Why does he do that as a banker, as a politician? Because he says the following: this is an investment in the future. It's not that he doesn't say this is a security issue, I have to, you know, it's a security, it's a problem. No, he says this is an investment, this is positive, this is good. Because if disasters don't occur, this is a place where you have volcanoes, monsoons, earthquakes, sea level rise, tsunamis, you name it. If disasters don't occur, then my disaster reduction measures builds capability, and I help adapt to climate change. It's a no-regret investment. I'm a banker. I know about no-regret investments. That's what he says. But if disasters occur, then I have 0 casualties. So I have all my voters alive, basically. And I have much less economic damages. So it reduces risks, and therefore it increases business returns and economic welfare. Actually, he has increased in his province over the last 5 years, I think it's 500% of external investment in local industry and manufacturing because of this policy. And basically the key, and what he says finally is that this is a key to reduce to invest in risk reduction is both institutional. I'm investing in IT, improved technology, information technology, and building on indigenous knowledge. And therefore this becomes also a very feasible platform for good and sound and local governance, which in the end is the bottom line for solving security issues on the long run. So that's why we work on this subject. And Mette this morning referred to something, a common framework, something called the Hyogo Framework for Action, 2005 to 2015, which has the title, Building the Resilience of Nations and Communities to Disasters. This was a framework that was adopted a few years after the Kyoto Protocol, which is the climate change related agreement among states, was adopted. And it basically has 5 priorities. It builds on the fact that the overarching outcome of this framework is to reduce the losses substantially from natural hazards on economic, social, and environmental assets in lives and assets. So that's the overarching goal. 5 priorities. One is to make this issue a policy priority locally and nationally. The second objective is to really know the risks and take action, which means investment in risk assessments and knowledge based on where the risks are, vulnerabilities, etc. And then to establish early warning systems to constantly be aware of these issues. And thirdly, it's to build understanding and awareness, invest in research, innovation, education. And fourthly, to reduce the underlying risk factors, which is a very important point, which is to address the different social, economic, environmental, technical, physical issues of development to become climate-proof or to reduce the risks in these areas to other hazards. And finally, it has an objective and a very clear priority line of increased capacity to react, to respond, and to prepare and recover from something that happens. And as Mette said this morning, the fact that there is such a framework which very clearly sets out all the different priority areas, who does what, basically, in terms of national, regional, international, civil society, private sector, and a few other regional commitments, is very helpful because people among countries now start to compare notes and establish a modus operandi, legislation, policies, etc., that can help among states and also among local actors. Because that's my next point. Because we have been working in the United Nations. We are a member state organization. We have 193 member states. But within states, there are many local governments, right? Different sub-levels of political governance structures. And what we are trying to do now when it comes to reducing disaster risk, which in the end addresses security issues that we talked about before today, it goes down, many levels down on governance issues. Who takes decisions, who is involved, who actually implement whatever is being decided at national or international level. Normally it's at very local level. In addition to that, more than 50% today lives in cities of the world's population. A few years from now, a few decades from now, the prognostic says that maybe 70 to 80% of our population will live in cities or urban areas. Out of this, almost 2/3 of cities are actually close to the coastline. And we heard this morning, some of the scenarios of what's going to happen along the coastlines. So if 2/3 of all cities are going to be relocated because of difficulties in dealing with the penetration of sea, then we are in deep trouble. So this is just good to have in mind. Why do we need to focus also on local government, city administrations, and that type of political decision making? This is Saint Louis of Senegal. It's a historic city. It's a cultural heritage of declared by UNESCO as a cultural heritage of the humanity, because it has a colonial, very beautiful architecture. It has a lot of indigenous and original cultural values here, and it's totally getting swamped by water, as you can see here. It's an island, it's a semi-island, it's a peninsula. There is issues of bad engineering that has been now leading to water penetration into the urban systems, etc. The reason I'm showing this picture is that this is also becoming a security issue, because this whole day today is about security and climate change. But for us who work on disaster reduction issues, often linked to natural hazards, drought, too much water, earthquakes, tsunamis, etc., the linkages are not necessarily so clear, but when you start to look at physical evidence, you can see more the linkages. This is a city in a country with a mayor, with a local government, not from the same political party as the national government. It's not part of the capital. It's not the capital city of the country. However, through the engagement on climate change and the coastal area of the whole West African coast, where there are many, many cities with similar situation like this, the biggest one being Lagos in Nigeria, which is a country in its own right. I don't know how many millions now, but I think 20+ million people, similar problems in many areas. What is happening now is that these cities and the coastal areas are actually getting together to try to fix their problems. And that goes beyond national states. But it's actually driven by very young, eager, and good politicians that have been taking. So it becomes part of a movement talking about security, talking about development, talking about local governance that is becoming very interesting. So I get a bit afraid when I see too much of a focus on security, meaning that, you know, vigilance and military vigilance on whatever these kind of issues become, because sometimes new forces with different views on how to develop communities in a different way sometimes can be seen as a threat from the normal, let's say, the national security establishment, not necessarily because there is a threat to national security, but because there is an imbalance of political power. So I think we just need to be a bit careful when we talk about the comparisons of these issues. And I thought that was part of your point, actually, before. So what have we done in UNISDR, in the International Strategy for Disaster Reduction, to address what we believe is the future for getting real risk reduction in place? We believe that we need to work with our national governments, and we need to work with the local governments as well. And we want to target, well, have started to target both. Last year, we launched a campaign. Actually, I see here on the poster here, it says 2010-11 World Disaster Reduction Campaign, Making Cities Resilient, My Cities Getting Ready. We had a congress now a few months back, and the overwhelming plea was, please don't keep it for 2011, go on forever. So there's no time limit on this now. This is part of our new program. Making Cities Resilient has no time limit, so it goes on. And this is basically with the purpose of addressing the political need for local governments to understand and know more about these subjects, to get engaged and start to take action. So it's a political objective and it's a knowledge objective. And the second objective is related to what we said before, what Governor Salceda was saying, invest more wisely. Cities are being invested in every day, in transportations, in energy, in housing, in sewage systems, in energy choices, in education, in schools, in books, in whatever. Every day there is a lot of money going into the development of a city or of an urban area. And by applying the knowledge on climate information, other hazards, risks, vulnerabilities, etc., this investment can prevail. And finally, to build more safely and to share information on what are those technologies, those experiences and those different options that different cities have been experimenting. So we launched a campaign in May, and Karlstad was one of the founding fathers to this campaign. That's why I wanted to show you this picture, but now our Karlstad people left here. So when we launched the campaign in Bonn in May 2010, Karlstad was among the 10 local governments who actually sponsored the campaign from the beginning. And we want to continue working with Karlstad as much as we can, and with our Swedish counterpart MSB to move this forward. We have more than 900 cities now signed up from 65 countries around the globe, and many more is waiting to sign up. So this is about ISDR, this is about the campaign. We work much more than with cities, obviously. We have programs working with maintaining the Hyogo framework for action. We are monitoring the impact. Countries report back every 2 years on different stages of development in these 5 priority areas. There is a number of indicators. We had 133 countries now in May 2011 reporting back on progress. We see it's very frank reporting. There is a lot of internal, let's say, not critique is the wrong word, but it's not going that well, let's say. There are many gaps still in terms of what needs to be done. One of the major problems is exactly the first one in terms of political will, investments, and addressing the underlying risk factors. It's quite good in terms of doing assessments, studies, policies, preparedness capacities. The military is getting more involved. They have more logistical capacity. That is going quite well. The development side is less well. This is what countries tell us. That's interesting. And now we want the cities to start doing a similar exercise. We're also doing a biannual report. It's called the Global Assessment Report on Disaster Reduction. This year, the topic was on revealing risks as part of development. So we very much link this to the development patterns. And we work a lot with our different UN bodies, which is the political space where governments come together to decide on issues, right? We have the Sustainable Development discussions, we have the Climate Change Framework Convention, where we are very active. We have the Desertification Convention, we have the humanitarian space, the International Standing Committee for Humanitarian Action. And the previous speaker from NATO was actually mentioning this issue of the Security Council of the United Nations discussing climate change as a security issue in July this year. They did it also a few years back in 2007, where it was raised among some of the member states to really take it seriously as a security issue. The next big enemy of the world is going to be climate change, right? What was the conclusion? Actually, there is no resolution. I was looking again now just to make sure. There is no resolution because the fact is that member states have not agreed that climate change is an enemy, let's say, or is something that needs to have a resolution in terms of a security action. The Security Council decided or requested the UN Secretary General in 2007 to prepare a report to lay out what the UN believed was the security issues of climate change. And I will show you some conclusions that comes out of that report. But basically, one of the delegates were saying in the margin of this 2011 July meeting, what is the purpose? Are we supposed to send in troops and close down coal mines? Is that what we are supposed to do in Security Council? We just had a conversation about this outside now, but this was actually raised as a kind of semi-serious issue. What is the definition of a security problem? It is a problem. But is it a security problem or is it a development problem? Is it a matter of changing lifestyles for some people and taking action by other people? Or is it a matter of war and peace and peacekeeping? The small island developing states are, of course, those that are pushing most for climate change as an existential threat for them, because some of the islands are literally disappearing. And that is a security issue. It becomes a security issue for Europe and Australia and a few other countries that close their borders because they don't want them to come into their countries. So then it becomes a security issue. But not really climate change per se, but the consequences of population movement. So these were the 5 kind of channels where this UN report that was presented to the Security Council identified as issues linked to climate change. One, related to vulnerability. I think you spoke about it this morning as well. food security, human health, increases in human exposure to extreme events in general, it becomes a vulnerability issue. And that's why we do vulnerability assessments, and we work on risk assessments and policies to address that kind of vulnerabilities as well. It's a development issue in general, so it slows down or it reverses development processes if you have too many extreme events like San Luis or some of the things that we heard from previous speakers. It could undermine the capacity of states to maintain stability, and that then becomes a security issue. So in the end, some of the conflicts that you were talking about, you kind of managed to link them back to some type of drought or other type of natural hazard or disaster. The earthquake in Nicaragua at some stage led to a movement that throughout Somoza, and you had Bangladesh was actually split from Pakistan after a major cyclone, etc. So you can always trace back some of these issues of change, instability, and political change, sometimes very positive change, sometimes are triggered by natural hazards, such as those that we might see more of due to climate change. But on the other hand, from the other side, some other people would see that as a security threat, of course. Some people would see it as an opportunity for change. Other people would see it as a security challenge, not wanting the change. So who decides? It's also an issue of let's say, of security. But the Security Council in the UN did not yet want to take any decision on this. The third point was coping and security. I mentioned migration, the competition over natural resources, other types of coping responses of households and communities, domestic conflicts, etc. That could be the direct impact of climate change. Statelessness, I mentioned the islands that are sinking in the Pacific, and the fact that it is a problem already, it's happening already. So it's an issue of rights, of migration, of policies, border control, etc. And finally, does it lead us to an international conflict or not? Internal conflicts and international conflicts. And then, on the other hand, this has implications for international cooperation, right? As we heard our previous speaker also mentioning. This is laid out in a very thick report. It's available on anybody who's interested in reading this. It was discussed, it was considered. But no special resolution has been taken. But the fact that it's discussed is a very positive thing, because it actually means that the issue becomes more than just environmental issue, which it has been for many years now. And it's also linking it up more to development and security and governance issues. So where is the front line then of security and climate change? It's not so easy, and I think you made an excellent presentation. I'm sure that if reading the book, we will see many other details of this. But we just have Bangkok now. One of these pictures is from Bangkok, underwater right now. Bangkok is one of our resilient cities. It's the governors of the 5 last governors over the last, I think, 14 years in Bangkok have consistently taken very smart decisions on how to climate-proof Bangkok. There is increased capacity of response. They have a lot of levees. They have flood protection. There is very many good examples of how to deal with flood. Now it's completely overwhelmed, and they just had to release the water. So again, it's overwhelming. It's not yet resilient, right? Because we don't yet see if this can bounce back or not. We don't know what's going to happen after this time. We have our office in Bangkok. People are being evacuated from their homes. The offices are not working. So de facto, we'll see what happens there. Also mention some of the positive things. You know, we talk about conflict and we talk about security. I also already mentioned a few things, but there are some. These extreme events lead also to conflict resolution in some cases. Is it sustainable? Is it fragile? We don't know, but it can reduce tensions. We have seen it, and de facto, when this happens, or when it happens in terms of solving a conflict or creating a conflict, most often or never, it's the event itself that triggers the conflict or solve the issue. There is a lot of things in addition that happens, of course. I think it's also, let's not simplify too much, because if we simplify too much, it's too easy to, like, let's say for military action, let's say, or for very radical political decisions to be taken based on maybe not too many facts. I don't think we need to talk about that. This I wanted just to mention because it's also about money. We spoke about money this morning, and I think that Mette mentioned that you had in MSB 25 million next year for prevention that you could share with the local governments in cost sharing for intervening in doing certain risk-reducing actions, let's say. So if you look at the military budget of the globe in 2003, it was 956 billion according to this particular study. I think there are some different figures depending who you look at. But if you look at what the UN has calculated in terms of solving some of the Millennium Development Goals over 11 years, in terms of providing universal access to water, reducing infant mortality, and the universal primary education, just to mention 3 of the goals, it would take over a period of 11 years 2% of military expenditures on annual basis. So if you start to look at those type of comparisons, it's a bit scary as well. And then you start to think, what is the security issue here, and where do we spend our money? So maybe there is a way of talking to our NATO colleagues, to talking to other types of military counterparts. How do we balance a little bit the budgets? Because the security issue can be solved if some of the development issues are solved. That's for sure. And that's very much linked to same issues of climate change. I only have 4 more minutes, so I'm going to quickly wrap up here. But what we have seen in our studies, and it's published in the Global Assessment Report for Disaster Risk Reduction, there has been a very significant drop in flood mortality, especially in Asia, in Southeast Asia and East Asia. And that's obviously due to much better preparedness, much better, let's say, action being taken to reduce mortality risk. Economic losses and economic risk is skyrocketing because we are exposing ourselves much more to harm's way, and this is still a big problem, of course. So when we, and again, you can't probably see this, but this comes from this UN report that I referred to that was presented to the Security Council. And it's basically my final remark is on this, because what the report says and what we say in UNISDR and what we say in the Hyogo Framework for Action is that to reduce disaster risk and reduce the effects of extreme events due to climate change, and then indirectly addressing some of the security issues, is really about examining the pre-existing social, economic, and environmental situation, context, or threats. I mean, this is sustainable development, the pillars of sustainable development, right? And I think that's the key message. Look at where we stand, how do we plan our societies, where do we spend our money in this, how much do we share the information on risks, how much do we work with population, how much is the participation across the political domain, locally, nationally, etc. And something that somebody else was saying as well, threats has been built up over time, right? It's nothing that comes overnight. And the public investment, if we would only, one of our kind of strategies for the next 5 years is to work with governments and investing in risk-reducing measures in all public investment. I think you said it, I think several people have already said this today, and if we are able to do climate change adaptation, mitigation, and risk-reducing efforts only in the public sector, where kind of government has a say, a strong say, we would come a very long way. And we are doing country by country some very detailed loss assessments to be able to argue for this to happen. And the picture you see right here is about schools and hospitals and roads and sewage systems and communication systems that have been lost due to either very low intensive, what we call extensive disaster, where you have frequent occurrence over a big territory of floods, droughts, even landslides, etc., versus very high intensive, big impact earthquakes, tsunamis, like the big booms, let's say, which doesn't happen very often, but have big losses. And the impact on schools, health facilities, and systems that are publicly owned and run is enormous. Complexity of solutions needs complexity complexity of the problem needs complexity of solutions. And finally, it's all about people and participation, governance, local actions. And I think that combining the science not only of understanding, in the case of climate change, the climate science, but also understanding the behavioral science of the political systems, plus people and the social fabric of the culture community is the key to little by little, stage by stage, and little by little addressing this problem together. And we are very happy to now, just a final note on the climate change. We have now, for the first time, we are preparing with IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, a special report on extreme climate event and disaster risk management. It's going to be published. It has been now taken over 2 years to get together the climate scientists with the risk management people, practitioners, because they are not scientists, according to at least to the climate scientists, but these two communities together in a room to actually look at those two issues together and come up with a conclusion. We have a first report coming out for review now in November. And I think little by little, we bring in the social science, we bring in the let's say, the political systems into this equation to get solutions that are more applicable to reality. So that's all for me. Thank you very much.